Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member from Kings Hands. Mr. Speaker, it is a great pleasure, as always, to rise in this House on behalf of the residents of my riding of Davenport to speak on the Opposition Day motion put forward by the Conservatives that calls on our government to present a federal budget rooted in fiscal responsibility with no new taxes, a path to balance, and a meaningful fiscal anchor. Mr. Speaker, we are well aware that elevated inflation and the rise of gas prices are leading Canadians to worry about the cost of living and how it's affecting their everyday lives. Let me remind everyone who's in this venerable House today and all those listening of a few things. First, inflation is a global issue. Initially, it was due to the global oil prices, the pandemic, supply chain problems, and the way the virus has changed our spending habits. But we also know, Mr. Speaker, that inflation is now exacerbated due to the illegal war by Russia in Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, since the beginning of the pandemic, our federal government has been tireless in our efforts to protect Canadians, to support them through the ongoing challenges, and to bridge them through the post-pandemic recovery. This significant fiscal policy support has contributed to a rapid and resilient recovery so far. I would also add, Mr. Speaker, that we have provided the most generous emergency supports in the world, and if not the most generous, then among the most generous of all the countries in the world. The motion we're speaking to today asks for the federal government to present a federal budget that's rooted in fiscal responsibility and also to provide meaningful fiscal anchors. Well, Mr. Speaker, we have been fiscally responsible every step of the way of the pandemic, as well as since we've been first elected in late 2015. Indeed, the entire pandemic, we've been in strong fiscal shape with the lowest net debt to GDP ratio of the G7. In addition, our GDP has returned to near pre-pandemic levels in the third quarter of 2021, and it grew by an annual rate of 6.7% in the fourth quarter of 2021. On top of that, Moody's and S&P has reaffirmed Canada's AAA credit rating, and more, Stats Canada Labour Force survey showed that the labour market gained 337,000 jobs in February of this year, and we've recovered overall 112% of the jobs that we lost at the peak of the pandemic. So, Mr. Speaker, we have been fiscally responsible. We continue to be fiscally responsible, and we will be fiscally responsible moving forward. Mr. Speaker, we've also had meaningful fiscal anchors. Those anchors have been net GDP to debt ratios, as mentioned earlier, as the best in the G7, as well as an outstanding jobs growth number, in addition to our overall GDP growth. And the result is that our economy is roaring back as it continues to try to come out of this pandemic into the post-pandemic world and economy. And I just want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that it's because of the emergency supports and the generous emergency supports that's been provided throughout the pandemic by our federal government that the economic foundation was strong and that companies could pivot and pivot back quickly as we're trying to come out of this pandemic. Now, saying all that, Mr. Speaker, I do want to highlight some elements of the federal government's recovery plan that we've announced so far. Our current recovery plan is targeted towards growth-enhancing and job-creating initiatives. Initiatives such as investments to support childcare and the adoption of new technologies that will help boost supply, increasing supply for the economy to grow without the risk of higher inflation. And as the situation across the country has improved, our federal government has moved from very broad-based support to more targeted measures that will provide help where it is needed, when it is needed. When the new variants and major outbreaks occurred, lockdowns and resource and capacity restrictions were painful but necessary last resort to break the chain of transmission and to save lives. That's why, Mr. Speaker, this past December, we announced that we were temporarily expanding the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit and the local lockdown program to support workers and businesses that were affected by capacity restrictions of 50% or more. We also temporarily lowered the current month revenue decline threshold requirement for employers to access the local lockdown program from 40% to 25%. This means that eligible employers could receive wage and rent subsidy support from 25% up to 75%, depending on how much revenue that they had lost. For workers, Mr. Speaker, this means that if they work in a region that introduces capacity restrictions of 50% or more, they can qualify for the Canada Worker Lockdown Benefit. This enables Canadians to put $300 a week in their pockets to supplement lost wages. Mr. Speaker, like all Canadians, we hope that lockdowns and capacity restrictions will be a thing of the past. We know that Canadians are tired of COVID-19, but the unfortunate reality is that COVID-19 is not quite tired of us. So we put these supports in place so that public health authorities can make the right, albeit difficult decisions, knowing that the federal government could be there to continue to support workers, small businesses, and other employers in their communities when needed. And we extended these key enhanced lockdown support programs to ensure Canadians were protected and workers and businesses had access to the help they needed to sustain them during the Omicron wave. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of additional measures we have taken to support Canadians and address top issues affecting Canada's economic growth and prosperity. Last December, we introduced Bill C-8, which seeks to address housing affordability through the implementation of a national annual 1% tax on the value of non-resident, non-Canadian-owned residential real estate in Canada that is considered to be vacant or underused, something our federal government announced as part of Budget 2021 to crack down on underused housing. The bill would introduce a new act, the Underused Housing Tax Act, to ensure that non-resident, non-Canadian owners, particularly those who use Canada as a place to passively store their wealth in housing, to pay their fair share of Canadian tax beginning in the 2022 calendar year. We're also working to address the supply chain issues, the issue of supply chain disruptions from around the world and shipping bottlenecks that have made it harder for Canadians and for businesses to get the products and supplies they need, and in many cases are contributing to rising prices. Mr. Speaker, to help strengthen supply chains and address bottlenecks, the federal government has launched a new targeted call for proposals under the National Trade Corridors Fund to assist Canadian ports with the acquisition of cargo storage capacity and other measures to relieve supply chain congestion. The fund will dedicate up to $50 million to support eligible priority projects. So, Mr. Speaker, today we are on strong economic footing. Our federal government has also prioritized putting the lives of Canadians first. This has meant that we have had one of the lowest mortality rates in the G7 due to COVID-19. In addition, we're making vaccine-free and a priority. As of March 25th, over 85% of Canadians 5 and older are fully vaccinated, and the Canadian economy has seen the benefits of prioritizing our health. Given all of the aforementioned emergency and economic supports, the Canadian labour market rebounded strongly from the Omicron wave in February. And I would add that the recovery and economic growth has been broad-based and has been supported by solid underlying fundamentals with ongoing rebound in sectors hardest hit by the pandemic. So, Mr. Speaker, our federal government is, and this is in conclusion, our federal government is determined to continue to do what is necessary to sustain the recovery, to provide help where it's still needed, to create jobs, and to set the stage for strong growth for years to come. From the start of the pandemic, we understood that having a job is essential to Canadians' economic well-being. That's why our investments have been so singularly focused on employment and why Canada's experienced one of the fastest job recovery in the G7. Canadians can remain confident, Mr. Speaker, that they have a strong hand at the wheel of the federal government in safeguarding and growing our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.